What if the wealthiest rancher in the valley, who owned more cattle than most men had ever seen, wasn't haunted by rivals, but by ghosts? What if every night, as he pretended to sleep, a shy maid whispered secrets into the firelight, secrets never meant for his ears? And what would happen when the moment came that he opened his eyes and changed both their lives forever? The Wyoming wind cut like a blade across the valley, sharp and merciless, as if nature itself wanted to scrape away every trace of warmth from the land. On the porch of the largest ranch house for 50 miles, Ethan Rollins stood unmoving, his broad shoulders wrapped in a wool coat that did little to soften the cold. To any stranger, he looked like the picture of success. 32 years old, master of 5,000 acres, cattle worth a fortune, and a house filled with imported rugs and crystal lamps. But no man staring at the horizon that way could be called fortunate. 3 winters earlier, fever had stolen his wife Sarah and their infant son James. Ethan had buried them beneath the cottonwoods, and since that day, the great house had been filled with nothing but echoes. He worked harder than any hired hand, buying land, expanding his herd, pretending that more wealth could drown out the silence. Yet the hollowness only deepened. On this evening, as the sun bled into the mountains, he heard a voice behind him, timid, careful. "Mr. Rollins?" He turned to see Clara Bennett, the new maid. She was barely 20, fresh from Ohio, her hair the color of wheat and her eyes always lowered, as if afraid to look too long. In her plain brown dress, she seemed a shadow in the doorway, small, fragile, almost transparent. "Supper's ready, sir," she whispered. "Mrs. Henderson says it's beef stew with fresh bread." Ethan nodded, though his feet refused to carry him inside. Clara shifted awkwardly, her shawl pulled tight. "Shall I set it in the dining room? Or—" Her voice faltered against the cold evening air. "The study," Ethan said at last. "I have ledgers to review." She dipped a tiny curtsy and disappeared. Yet as the stars broke open above the valley, Ethan found himself wondering why the shy maid lingered in his thoughts at all. Perhaps it was the way she moved, like a ghost in his house of ghosts. Or perhaps it was because, deep down, he sensed that this quiet girl carried a secret. A secret that would test the walls he had built around his heart and reveal a truth that neither wealth nor grief could bury. Inside the study, firelight cracked against the oak walls while ledgers sprawled across Ethan's desk like an army of numbers marching nowhere. Wealth, land, cattle, all lined neatly in columns. Yet none of it filled the silence that pressed upon him. When Clara entered with the supper tray, she moved as though the floor itself might scold her for being too heavy. Her hands trembled as she placed the steaming bowl of stew and the loaf of bread on his desk. "Thank you," Ethan said softly. His voice carried weight, but no warmth. Clara's eyes flickered to the portrait above him, Sarah in her wedding dress, little James in her arms. "You had a beautiful family, sir," she whispered, then bit her lip, realizing she had spoken beyond her station. "They were," he answered simply. Her cheeks flushed crimson before she slipped out the door. The latch clicked shut, but the echo of her words clung to the room like smoke. Ethan ate mechanically, his eyes drifting from the portrait to the closed door. That night, as he walked upstairs, a sound stopped him. A voice, low and steady, coming from the kitchen. He followed quietly, his boots muffled on the runner. There she was, sleeves rolled back, scrubbing dishes under the glow of a single lamp. She spoke not to anyone but to herself, her voice trembling like a secret forced into the world. "Tomorrow, I'll polish the silver again," she murmured. "Even if Mrs. Henderson says once a week is enough. Such fine silver, worth more than Papa's store ever was." Her shoulders quivered. She gripped the basin edge hard. "No crying, Clara Marie. You're lucky for this roof, these wages. Some girls end up worse. Mr. Rollins is fair, even if he looks so sad." Those eyes, like he's staring at ghosts. The words struck him like a blade. Ghosts, that was all she saw in him. He stepped back into the dark, unable to bear another syllable. Yet her honesty haunted him. The next night he returned to the study, this time letting the fire burn low. He loosened his collar and leaned back, closing his eyes, as if exhaustion had claimed him. When the door creaked, Clara's light steps entered. She gathered dishes quietly, then hesitated. Ethan felt the whisper of fabric as she draped a blanket across his shoulders. "Poor man," she breathed. "Working yourself to the bone won't bring them back." "I know. I tried it myself." Ethan's chest tightened, but he kept still. She coaxed the dying fire to life, then lingered at the portrait. "You had a beautiful family, Mr. Rollins. I hope you find peace someday. I know what it's like to lose everything. But you're still here, still breathing. That must count for something." Her words pierced deeper than grief ever had. When the door shut softly behind her, Ethan opened his eyes to the glow of firelight, and for the first time in years, he wondered about tomorrow. The nights that followed became a strange ritual. Ethan left his ledgers open, his collar loosened, his eyes shut as though the weight of numbers had driven him into sleep. And every night, just past 11, Clara would enter. Sometimes she hummed softly while clearing the tray. Sometimes she whispered half-formed thoughts about sunlight on the parlor curtains, about her mother's lessons in keeping a house. Always she paused at the portrait, her gray eyes lingering on the painted faces of Sarah and James. On the third night, she placed a small tin beside his glass. "Your hands, Mr. Rollins," she murmured. "They're cracked from the cold. Mama used to make this salve from beeswax and herbs. Maybe it will help." Her touch brushed the tin with reverence, as though offering it to the dead as much as the living. Ethan longed to thank her, to tell her he wasn't sleeping. Yet something stopped him. The spell of her kindness was fragile. He dared not shatter it. By the fifth night, her words grew bolder, tinged with confession. "Mrs. Henderson says you built all this with your own hands. Papa would have admired that. He believed America was where a man could make himself into anything." Her voice trembled. "He believed it so fiercely he gambled everything, our store, our home, and lost. That's why I'm here. Some girls on the train with me weren't so lucky. One went to a Denver dance hall. She cried the whole journey, knowing what kind of life awaited." Clara's breath hitched, but she pressed on. "That could have been me, if not for you." Ethan's fists tightened under the blanket. This timid girl who bowed her head and spoke barely a whisper by day, carried storms inside her heart by night. She had endured loss, shame, and fear, yet still managed to offer kindness. He began to wait eagerly for the hour when her voice would steal into the room like a lantern in darkness. But on the seventh night, the ritual fractured. Clara entered with a tray, but her steps faltered. Firelight revealed her face flushed and damp, her hands trembling as though the dishes were stones too heavy to bear. She set them down unsteadily, whispering to herself, "Just a little fever. Finish the chores, Clara. Don't be weak." When she swayed, Ethan could no longer pretend. He surged forward, catching her before she collapsed. "Miss Bennet," he said sharply. Her gray eyes widened with shock. You were awake all this time?" "You're burning up," he interrupted, his hand steadying her shoulder. "You shouldn't be on your feet." "I'm fine," she protested weakly. "Please don't trouble Mrs. Henderson. If she thinks I cannot work—" "Sit," Ethan commanded, guiding her firmly into the chair opposite his own. His tone left no room for defiance. Moments later, Mrs. Henderson arrived, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of Clara's fever-flushed face. "I knew you looked pale at supper," she muttered. "I didn't want to be a burden," Clara whispered. "Burden?" The housekeeper barked. "Working yourself into the grave isn't a kindness to anyone." Ethan's jaw hardened. "Send Tom for Dr. Morrison, now." "At this hour?" Mrs. Henderson blinked. "For one of my people," Ethan said, his voice firm as iron. "Send him." Clara's cheeks burned hotter than the fever when she realized the truth. "You heard me," she whispered. "All those nights, all those things I said." Ethan's gaze softened, though his voice stayed steady. "Not foolish, not shameful. Kind. Kinder than I deserved." Her eyes brimmed with tears, silent rivers cutting through the heat on her face. Before she could speak, the doctor arrived, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his mouth grumbling at being summoned past midnight. He examined Clara with brisk efficiency, then straightened. "Exhaustion. Underfed. Overworked. She'll live if she rests and eats properly." He gave Ethan a long, pointed look. "Strange to see you so concerned for a servant. But it's good to see you care about something besides cattle and ledgers again. When Clara was settled in her small room, Ethan lingered at her bedside. On the nightstand sat the little tin of salve she had left him. He turned it over in his hands, humbled. A girl with nothing to her name had seen his pain and sought to ease it. That thought struck him harder than any ledger figure ever had. 3 days passed. By Ethan's order, Clara was forbidden from chores. Despite her protests, she remained in bed. She fretted about wages, about being cast aside for failing her duty. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. Girl doesn't understand kindness. Been kicked too many times to expect it. On the 4th day, Ethan knocked gently. Clara sat propped against pillows, a needle and thread in her lap. She tried to rise, but he motioned her back. How are you feeling? Better, sir. I'll return to work tomorrow, I promise. You'll return when Dr. Morrison says, not before. His voice softened. I owe you an apology. Her brow furrowed. For what? For deceiving you, pretending to sleep, listening when I should not have. Her cheeks flushed crimson. Then you heard, everything? Everything, he admitted. Oh, how mortifying, she breathed, covering her face. Not mortifying, he said, his tone low and earnest, illuminating. Clara, your kindness reminded me that simple compassion still exists. You've done more for me in weeks than wealth or land ever could. Tears shimmered in her eyes. I know what loss feels like, Mr. Rollins. I only wanted you not to feel so alone. He reached for her hand, his calloused palm brushing hers. You'll do no more scrubbing floors. When you're well, I want you as head maid. Better wages, lighter duties, you've earned it. Her lips parted, astonished. But I've only been here 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, you've shown more heart than most do in a lifetime. Silence hung between them. Charged. Tender. Then, timidly, she asked, were you truly awake every night? Ethan allowed a faint smile, the first in years. Every night. Clara buried her face in her hands with a groan. Ethan rose, but in his chest, something long dead stirred. For the first time since Sarah and James, hope flickered. Fragile, uncertain, but alive. Winter deepened across the Wyoming Valley, the land buried under sheets of snow that groaned beneath hooves and boots alike. Ethan's life, once a relentless rhythm of ledgers and lonely suppers, had begun to change in quiet, imperceptible ways. Clara's presence lingered in every corner. He found himself waiting for her footsteps, her soft voice, the gentleness she carried like a hidden flame. Then, in February, the storm came. A blizzard rolled down from the mountains with no warning, shrieking across the valley like an army of ghosts. Ethan saddled his horse, determined to check the pregnant cows in the far pasture. The wind howled, snow blinding his eyes, slicing through his coat like knives. Hours later, half frozen, he staggered back to the ranch, more ice than flesh, his strength failing with every step. The kitchen door burst open. Clara's gasp cut through the storm's roar. Mr. Rollins! She seized his arm as he nearly collapsed, her small frame bearing more weight than seemed possible. She dragged him into the warmth, her face pale with terror. His hands were white, waxy, the first kiss of frostbite. No, she whispered fiercely, kneeling before him. Not you. Not like this. She rubbed his frozen fingers between her own, her breath quick and desperate. Mrs. Henderson hurried in with blankets, broth, heated stones. For an hour they fought to drag him back from the edge, spooning warm liquid past his chattering teeth, pressing heat against his limbs until agony returned the terrible fire of thawing flesh. Through it all, Clara never released his hands. Her touch was steady, her voice low, as if sheer will could anchor him to the living. You're safe, she whispered again and again. You're home. Sleep now. When dawn finally broke, sunlight spilling pale and golden through the window, Ethan opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Clara, dozing in a chair beside him, her hand still clasped around his. Her head rested awkwardly on the armrest, hair loosened from its careful bun. She looked nothing like the invisible maid who tiptoed through his house by day. She looked like the very force that had pulled him back from death's edge. And in that moment, Ethan Rollins understood something terrifying. The walls he had built around his grief were no longer unbroken. Clara had breached them quietly, insistently, with compassion instead of force. The richest rancher in the valley had discovered the one thing he could not control, the stirrings of his own heart. Spring came late that year, slow and uncertain, as though the land itself doubted whether warmth could return. Snow melted into streams, feeding meadows that blushed green once more. Calves stumbled on unsteady legs, wildflowers scattered color across the hills, and with every sunrise, Ethan felt something within him loosening, thawing. He noticed Clara everywhere now, not just in the chores she performed, but in the way her presence softened the house. He found excuses to linger when she brought tea, to ask her opinion on flowers for the parlor, to stand in the doorway longer than necessary. One afternoon, he caught her by the window, mending a shirt in a shaft of light. She looked up, startled, cheeks flushing. "Mr. Rollins?" she asked. "Ethan," he corrected softly. "You've cared for me more honestly than anyone has in years. If anyone has the right to call me by name, it's you." Her lips trembled, and she whispered it, "Ethan." It was the sweetest sound he had heard since Sarah's laughter. Weeks later came the barn dance at a neighbor's ranch. Music lifted into the night, fiddles and laughter tumbling across the valley. Ethan stood apart, fine coat marking him as the wealthiest man there, yet lonelier than any drifter. Then he saw her, Clara, in a plain blue dress, standing shyly against the wall. To him, she was the brightest star in the barn. He crossed the floor. "Miss Bennet," he said, offering his hand, "would you grant me this dance?" Her eyes widened. "Oh, no, I couldn't." "Everyone will stare." "Let them," he said, steady, kind, hesitant. She placed her hand in his. At first her steps were clumsy, her face flushed with nerves, but Ethan guided her gently. Then, suddenly, she laughed. A free, joyous laugh that rang through the rafters, startling every eye in the room. For one shining moment, Ethan felt grief lift from his chest, replaced by something wild and alive. When the music ended, the barn erupted in applause. Clara tried to retreat, but he held her hand. "One more," he asked softly. She met his gaze, gray eyes luminous, and nodded. But not everyone rejoiced. Whispers spread quickly about the rancher and his maid, about loneliness, blinding judgment, about a servant reaching above her station. Clara felt their stares at church, heard their mutters in the market. Shame pressed down heavier than any chore. One evening, unable to endure it, she packed a small bag. Her hands shook as she folded a plain dress, her heart breaking with every movement. Before dawn, she opened the door to leave, only to find Ethan already waiting, his figure carved against the dim light of the hall. "You were leaving," he said quietly. Tears welled in her eyes. "I can't bring shame to your name. People are talking. Let them talk," Ethan answered, his voice low but firm. "I lived for appearances once, and it left me empty. You brought me back to life. I won't lose that because of gossip." Clara shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You deserve someone your equal. Someone with a name, with standing. Not me." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes burning with conviction. "I already found her. My equal isn't measured in wealth or land. It's measured in heart. And Clara, yours is stronger than anyone I've ever known." Her breath caught, body trembling as though she stood at the edge of a cliff. "Ethan." He took her hands, rough palms closing around her delicate fingers. "Stay. Build a life here with me, not as a maid, as my partner, as my wife." The hallway fell into silence, except for the thud of her racing heart. Slowly, Clara lowered her bag. Tears became quiet sobs as she buried her face against his chest. "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. Then again, stronger. "Yes." The wedding was small, held beneath the cottonwoods where Sarah and James rested. Ethan spoke their names softly, asking for blessing, and when the wind stirred the branches above, he felt an answer. Clara wore a simple white dress, her hands trembling in his as they exchanged vows. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with a promise of renewal. The valley would talk, of course it would. Some called her a fortune seeker, others pitied the widower blinded by loneliness, but Ethan no longer cared. For the first time in years he felt whole. Clara, once the timid maid who whispered her thoughts to empty rooms, now stood beside him as his equal, his partner, his love. Together they faced the vast western horizon, not as two broken souls, but as one. That night, in the quiet ranch house, Ethan whispered into the dark, "Tomorrow is a new day." Clara, her head resting on his chest, smiled. "Yes," she said softly, "and this time we'll face it together." The man who had once drowned himself in wealth to escape grief now discovered a truth far greater. Love had returned, not in grandeur, but in the gentle courage of a woman who dared to see him not as a legend, not as a fortune, but as a man still capable of healing. And in that discovery lay the turning point of his life, the moment he finally chose the living over the dead, hope over despair. The first weeks of marriage unfolded quietly, without grandeur, like dawn breaking after a long night. Clara moved through the ranch not as a servant, but as mistress, though she carried no airs of pride. She touched every corner with warmth, fresh flowers in the parlor, curtains drawn to let in more light, laughter rising like music where once silence reigned. For the hands that had known only toil, the house became a place of peace. Ethan watched the transformation with a wonder he dared not voice. For years he had armored himself with wealth, believing more land, more cattle, more ledgers could shield him from sorrow. Yet it had taken a young woman's compassion to show him that love was not a fortress but an open door. When neighbors whispered, when gossip traveled through town, he held Clara's hand in public with unflinching steadiness. Her presence beside him was no shame but salvation. Yet life on the frontier knew no pause for happiness. Work demanded its due. Ethan rose at dawn to ride the fence lines, to check the herds scattered across endless hills. Clara learned the rhythm of ranch life, too caring for workers when storms cut them down, organizing stores, offering comfort where hardness had once ruled. She was more than mistress. She became the soul of the household. One evening, as spring ripened into summer, Ethan returned from the range to find Clara on the porch. She sat with mending in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the horizon where storm clouds gathered, painted copper by the setting Sunday. When he sat beside her, she slipped her hand into his. "I used to think," she said softly, "that the West would swallow me whole, that I was too small for this land. But here with you, I feel strong." Ethan squeezed her hand, his voice low. "You are the strongest person I know." The storm broke that night, rain hammering the earth, thunder shaking the rafters, and in the fury of wind and water, Ethan realized that life would never be free of tempests. But unlike before, he no longer faced them alone. With Clara, storms were no longer omens of despair, but trials that could be endured, even overcome. By midsummer, the valley was alive with color and sound. Calves bawled in the pastures, meadowlarks trilled from fence posts, and fields of wildflowers swayed beneath the mountain winds. Ethan often found himself pausing in the saddle, watching the world with new eyes, as though Clara's laughter had repainted the very land itself. But not all voices were kind. At the mercantile in town, whispers followed Clara like shadows. She was a maid, some said. He married beneath him. Others sneered that she was clever, that she had caught the richest man in the valley with soft words and downcast eyes. Clara heard every word, though she pretended not to. At night, when Ethan found her staring into the fire too long, he knew the gossip had sunk its claws. One evening, she confessed what lay heavy on her heart. "Perhaps they are right," she murmured. "Perhaps I don't belong at your side." Ethan turned her face toward him, his eyes fierce. "Clara, belonging is not given by birth or station. It is forged in the choices we make, in the strength we carry. You have given me back my life. Who else could belong here more than you?" Her tears slipped silently down her cheeks, but she smiled through them. In that moment, the doubts that had threatened to unravel her steadied. She was no longer a timid maid, whispering to shadows. She was a woman whose place was earned by heart, not by wealth. The months passed, each season leaving its mark. When autumn came, Ethan and Clara worked side by side to bring in the last of the hay, their laughter mingling with the shouts of ranch hands. When winter crept down the mountains once more, the house did not echo with emptiness, but rang with Clara's gentle songs as she stitched by the hearth. One bitter night, as wind rattled the windows, Ethan reached across the table and caught her hand. "Do you know what I feared most?" he asked. She looked up, puzzled. "What?" "That I would spend the rest of my life with ghosts for company. But you gave me back the living. You made tomorrow worth reaching for." Clara's smile glowed like firelight. "Then we will face tomorrow, always together." The following spring, the cottonwoods blossomed white against the sky, their branches whispering above the graves of Sarah and James. Ethan brought Clara there often, never hiding the past, never pretending it had not carved him into the man he was. Clara would kneel, arranging wild flowers at the headstones, her touch reverent, her silence filled with a compassion deeper than words. Ethan felt no guilt bringing her here. Instead, he sensed peace, an unspoken bridge between the life he had lost and the life he had found. Neighbors continued to talk, but over time, words lost their sting. They saw Clara's quiet strength when she nursed a ranch hand through fever, her steadfastness when she stood beside Ethan at town meetings, her dignity in the face of those who doubted her. Gradually, respect replaced suspicion. Some even whispered that perhaps she was exactly the woman Ethan Rollins had needed all along. One summer's evening, the ranch hosted a gathering. Lanterns glowed in the barn, fiddles sang, boots stomped. Clara, in a simple dress the color of twilight, moved through the crowd with ease now, smiling without fear. Ethan watched her, pride swelling in his chest, not the pride of ownership, but of gratitude. He knew wealth could be measured in acres and cattle, but his true fortune was walking toward him, her gray eyes bright with life. When the music slowed, Ethan led Clara outside beneath the stars. The valley stretched endless before them, a tapestry of shadow and moonlight. He drew her close, his voice low. "Clara, do you realize what you've done? You've turned a house of grief into a home of hope." She rested her head against him, her voice steady. "And you've shown me that broken things can be made whole again, even hearts." They stood in silence, listening to the wind sweep across the fields. For Ethan, the future no longer felt like an empty ledger waiting to be filled. It was alive as the woman in his arms. He had lived too long among ghosts. Now, at last, he belonged to the living. In the wide silence of the Wyoming Valley, where mountains carved their shadows into the earth and storms swept across the plains without mercy, Ethan Rollins had once believed himself destined to live among ghosts. Wealth had filled his barns, but not his heart. Numbers had crowded his ledgers, but not his soul. For years he mistook power for protection, thinking no one could wound him if he buried himself beneath cattle and land. Yet grief had still found him, hollowing him until even his victories rang empty. Clara Bennett arrived as little more than a whisper, timid footsteps on wooden floors, a maid who dared not lift her eyes. No one would have marked her as extraordinary. But compassion rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives like a candle in a darkened room, soft but unyielding, pushing shadows back inch by inch. Her kindness was not grand. It was quiet, woven into the fabric of ordinary days. A blanket draped over weary shoulders, a fire coaxed back to life. Words spoken not to impress, but because the truth inside her heart demanded release. And through such simple gestures, she reminded Ethan of what grief had made him forget. That to be alive is not merely to breathe, but to connect, to love, to endure together. The world judged their union. Some mocked, others whispered. But courage is not proven in the absence of scorn. It is proven when one chooses love despite it. Ethan and Clara's story was not about a rancher marrying a maid. It was about two broken souls daring to believe in wholeness again. About the way pain can shape people into stone, and how tenderness can turn that stone back into flesh. Every life carries storms. Some tear down homes, others erode the heart. But storms are not only endings, they are tests, sharpening those who endure. Ethan discovered that surviving grief did not mean closing himself off, but opening himself to the risk of being hurt again, because only in that risk could healing take root. Clara discovered that worth is not bestowed by the world's approval, but revealed in the quiet strength to stand beside someone and say, "You are not alone." So the moral of their tale is this: dignity is not in wealth, but in kindness. Courage is not in conquest, but in compassion. And love, the kind that restores, that resurrects, that breathes warmth into a frozen soul, often comes not with fanfare, but in the gentle voice of someone willing to see us as we are, and still stay. When the valley winds rise again, when storms rattle the cottonwoods, Ethan and Clara will stand together, not as master and servant, not as rancher and maid, but as partners, proof that even in a land as harsh as the West, the heart can still find its home.